Hi, gents, smiling emoji. He's actually written that out just in case, I need some help there. Hi, gents, smiling emoji. The thing I'm most looking forward to with Switch 2 is playing my games with a better frame rate, which in my mind is making this feel more like a Switch Pro. Had there ever have been a Switch Pro, what hardware would you have expected to see in it? And how much would that differ from what we're getting with Switch 2? I'd like to start off with a few thoughts on this one, because I think there's two potential routes forward they could have taken with a Switch Pro. First of all, the basic one, the Tegra X1 was revised, the Marico chip, and it has a huge amount of overclocking capabilities, both in terms of CPU, GPU, and crucially memory bandwidth. So as we discussed last week, we were hoping that, or rather one of our supporters was hoping that there could be some sort of boost mode unlock that Nintendo would add, but I don't think that would ever happen because we've got Switch 2 coming out, which should hopefully do the same thing. So yes, I mean, there's a ton of, just look up Marico or Switch OLED overclocking on YouTube. I'm sure there's a bunch of videos there you can look at. But, there have been the cases where games that are pegged at 30 are able to run at 60 or close to it. That's the kind of thing that could possibly have been done with a Switch Pro. The second option I was going to come up with was Tegra X2, which was very, very close to Tegra X1. Same GPU, if memory serves, same 256 CUDA cores, same Maxwell architecture, but it did have double the memory bandwidth. And similar to the Marico chip, I believe it was on 16 nanometer. So in theory, then, you would have had an even more potent Switch Pro, but it would definitely have been a device of that generation. But Oliver, the final bit of this question, how much would that differ from what we're getting with the Switch 2? And the answer is a huge amount, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at a pro console in this vein, you're really looking at something that's an expanded version of probably an architecture that's not too different from that original architecture, not breaking too much there, and probably not something that is going to require a lot of additional effort from developers. But when you look at the Switch 2 with Ampere, Cortex A78C, 12 gigs of memory, 128-bit memory bus, support for mesh shading, support for ray tracing, the tensor cores up the wazoo, all these features. That's not a Switch Pro. That's a Switch 2. And anyway, you slice it, it's just not even in the same universe in terms of feature sets. So yeah, I'd say that is a completely different product to any kind of Switch Pro. But I'd echo Rich's comments there. You could see just a boosted Marico Switch 1 that eats up that additional battery margin, basically, instead of going from like 2.5 hours to 4 hours of battery life. Maybe you go from 2.5 hours to 2.5 hours of battery life, and all of a sudden your system is 30% faster or whatever in comparable workloads, right? That could be the case there. Or yeah, Tegra X2 would be my other answer there. Possibly, or maybe some custom NVIDIA chip that was just a bigger GPU, something like that, potentially there. But yeah, lots of room for improvement there, especially because the Switch 1 was like the last generation of planar transistor-based technologies there. It was not an ideal process, 20 nanometers. It was notoriously difficult to work with. There were a lot of really bad chips in that process, like some of the Snapdragon 800 line chips were quite bad. When you go over to 16 nanometers, all of a sudden you have FinFETs, you have much better control over that chip, and all of a sudden you can do a lot more with it in terms of clock frequency without running into too many issues with power and leakage and things like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm still intrigued by the whole Switch Pro hysteria that there was a couple of years ago, because the firmware hacking guys, the guys who did the Atmosphere firmware, custom firmware for Switch, were basically poo-pooing the whole thing right from the off. And indeed, we never got one. And I still think that Switch Pro was basically the Switch OLED being confused with formative work for Switch 2. We first heard about the T239 processor in Switch 2 way back in 2021, which kind of fits in with that sort of timeline.